Hi everyone, Gabathy here, and it's time to talk about Silent Hill once again for this lovely little Halloween season. How do you come up with a name like Silent Hill? Newsflash, jackass. All hills are silent. Also, there's like more than 3 of them in the world.
Yeah, that's not funny.
What's up everybody? I figured it was high time I talk about Silent Hill 3. If you've been keeping up with the annual tradition, you'd know that I've already done videos on the first and second ones respectively, and the exact same logic still applies here, only this time we're talking about my personal favorite. Obviously, the Silent Hill games are very special to me, and the biggest reason is simply because there's nothing like them. I mean, there are great games that try to emulate the same kind of atmosphere, but many of these titles completely stand alone, which is totally fine. Unfortunately, the Silent Hill series has stayed relatively consistent through to this year, but out of all the horror franchises to last this long, it only has a few decent games. Nobody fucking hates Silent Hill like Silent Hill fans, which mostly has to do with Team Silent disbanding after the 4th one. They only made 4 games, and for many people, the 3rd one is considered the last time that Silent Hill was remotely good. Of course, Eyepatch thinks it's the death of the series, and I like him, and I like his content, but he's silly and wrong, and this video smells bad. The first Silent Hill is just solid. It does everything it needs to do when establishing the premise. The aesthetic is fascinating, and the story is extremely confusing, which I like a lot. Silent Hill 2 is often considered the best, and for damn good reason. There are no other games with an aesthetic quite like it. It managed to tell a surreal, beautiful, and emotional story that still hits me like a truck every time I play through it. But in terms of horror, while the aesthetic is unique, I also consider it the least terrifying of the 4, which is saying a lot because it is a pretty fucking creepy game. It's a genuine masterpiece, and it can be unsettling at times, but it's also just generally very sleepy and somber, which I really like. As for the ones I consider the scariest, well, that would be today's topic with Silent Hill 3. This game is terrifying, and it also refined the combat to match that. Also, rather than being another standalone story like Silent Hill 2, this one expands on the lore of the first game. Some people don't like that, but again, they're silly. It's the easiest one to understand as far as stories go. You know, there are some surreal and confusing moments here and there, but this one is much easier to digest, and even makes the first game simpler to understand as well, which is what contributed to most of my analysis in that video respectively. You play as Heather, a girl who watches too much anime. Join her as she threatens to stab a police officer, does a little shimmy in honor of her dead father, gets psychologically tormented by an incel, and repeatedly makes fun of a man she's never fucking met.
Oh, forget it. This is way too gross. Who would even think of doing something so disgusting?
Silent Hill 3 is an excellent horror game that set the bar for atmospheric horror in a way that games even nowadays can never quite replicate. I bring to you the scariest game I've ever fucking played in a long time, Silent Hill 3. Already off the bat, the game opens up with an unsettling cutscene. We cut back and forth between an empty carnival ride going at a nauseatingly fast pace and a shot of a strange figure shaking violently. The animation is blurry and hard to make out, making it all the more unnatural and eerie. While the first 2 games open straightforwardly with our characters arriving in Silent Hill, this one takes a completely different approach. You do start off in Silent Hill. In fact, you're in an area that was present in the first game. However, all of this is a nightmare, as well as a premonition of what takes place much later. While some people may take issue with this, I think it's good to make some changes to the lineup. James went to Silent Hill because he felt compelled to, but Heather's situation is a lot different. She was pretty much born in Silent Hill, so rather than being drawn to the town much in the same way that her father or James were, it's actually more like the town itself is drawn to her. No matter what she does, she cannot escape it. The opening section is already brimming with atmosphere, and the graphics are just as gorgeous here as they were in the second one. The distorted bass, the heavy breathing, the subtle fog and dark empty wall of nothingness surrounding you on all sides. The game just started, and I'm already very uncomfortable. I also want to take note of Robbie the Rabbit. There are 2 of them just sprawled about the area, and his existence is quite peculiar. You see him several times in this game, and from this point forward, I'm pretty sure he shows up in, like, every Silent Hill game that follows. And he doesn't have any symbolic purpose to be in these games. It's just the mascot of the amusement park you're at that just becomes a bit of an Easter egg because Team Silent was just so fascinated by it. However, these things freak me the fuck out because even though my radio isn't going off, I just keep expecting them to get up at any moment and fucking attack me. I don't have any particular interpretation for this character, but his overbearing presence is certainly creepy, and it already makes me uneasy right from the start, which shows you exactly what kind of game this is going to be. I only take note of him because it strangely emphasizes the priorities of this game very well. Something playful and innocent that is slowly corrupted, symbolizing the loss of Heather's innocence and purity as she grows up. The combat of Silent Hill 3 is actually my personal favorite from the entire series, and that's because it's given a little bit more versatility and depth than the last two games. Those stiff movements that put emphasis on your character's lack of combat experience are still very much present, but Heather is much younger than both of our previous protagonists, so she's a lot quicker. She's also got a temporary block button that, when timed right, reduces the amount of damage she takes, which is part of what I like about this game. In the last two, I didn't really think too much about how I killed my enemies, only if I should or not, but this time around I'm actually putting thought into every single decision I make, from what weapon seems to be the most useful to what strategy would work best against each enemy and so on. Some people take issue with the combat of Silent Hill 3, stating that a young girl like Heather wouldn't carry these weapons, much less know how to use them, but this criticism is disingenuous. As I established in the videos covering the first and second games, the character you played as had different goals, so the games were set up differently. Harry was still clinging on to life, so the combat and atmosphere were both tense. James doesn't particularly care if he dies, so there's a somber, mysterious tone throughout, and the combat is much simpler and more casual. Heather, on the other hand, is very different from the others. The gameplay is as abrasive and overwhelming as it is to correlate with Heather's fear of growing up, as well as the constant harassment and torment she gets from the Order. Her rage and frustration is partly why she gets such powerful weapons. She's a very defensive person with a strong, stubborn head on her shoulders. Once you step through the door, you're already attacked by a fucking double head, and once you make it further down this path, you run into two closers. Big motherfuckers that take some serious heat to kill. You're already at threat of dying, and we haven't even established the main narrative yet, and I think it really speaks to the intensity of the game. The first two eased you into it slowly, but by this point you should already know what Silent Hill is all about, so this game just kind of tosses you right into the insanity with two of the most frightening enemies imaginable. But again, I will not touch on them quite yet. Another enemy you encounter is the Pendulum, one of the more dangerous enemies given they have invincibility frames, and they can also fly, and will pursue you stubbornly no matter where you go. Like I said, this game just got started, and it's already throwing so much shit at the player with no apology. The point is that right from the get-go, this game's fucking evil, and it wants to stab you and take your wallet, and I almost want to let it because I fucking love this game. It is a bit puzzling, but considering the player doesn't have to go particularly far before the dream sequence is over, I think it's fine. As you make your way down the roller coaster railway, you can hear this disturbing sound, like a creature eating something. And as you make your way down the rail, it slowly fades away, leaving you in complete silence save for the sound of Heather's footsteps. But once you make it to the end, a roller coaster comes, killing Heather and prompting her to wake up from her dream. This entire segment is honestly a brilliant way to open up the game. Since it takes a while for Heather to actually make it to Silent Hill, it works to establish the survival horror aspect of the game first and foremost, and even gives you a small taste of the combat. But in terms of the narrative, the dream's purpose is obviously through the efforts of Alessa, who is still deep down inside Heather. It should be noted that during the dream, Heather is killed by the end, so when the dream actually comes true, she knows to jump. But what I find more peculiar than that is the way she wakes up. She wasn't even sleeping in her own bed, just resting alone at a burger joint with the sunset bleeding through the blinds, lending the scene a dispirited tone. It's already clear from the get-go that Heather is very lonely and socially withdrawn, but more than that, it's also obvious that she doesn't take good care of herself. She doesn't get much sleep, but she also hardly even reacted to the nightmare. Even though it ends with her dying, she wakes up as if it were a normal dream, almost as if she doesn't particularly care all that much if she dies. Afterwards, she goes to the nearest payphone and calls her dad, the protagonist of the first game. The music is a lot less tense this time around. It's just a relaxed guitar strum with some simple chords. Very easygoing and laid back, adding to the wholesomeness of her conversation with her dad. Kind of reminds me of like a calmer Nirvana song or any of the other grunge rock songs from the 90s, which fits because that is definitely what Heather would listen to. Despite how sad she seems, she's almost a different person entirely when she speaks to him. It's very easy to tell that she has a lot of respect for her father and genuinely loves him. Afterwards, we meet Douglas Cartland. Though he does sound like a South Park character in the remake.
Heather, I need to speak with you. My name is Douglas Cartland. I'm a detective.
No, you've gone deaf too, you son of a bitch. I said
I've got my cock in my hand right now.
He's trying to speak with Heather, but she won't give him the time of day. It's clear that while she does love her father, Heather does not respect authority very much, and she has a hard time trusting people. She's very outspoken and rude, often at times irritable and moody, and at the same time, it's clear that Douglas is a bit driven by his job with little concern for boundaries. It's the first subtle indication of stalker behavior, and that's going to be consistent through each and every character because Heather is the closest thing to a good person this fucking game has. She only manages to get away from him by going to the bathroom, and it's here where the game can actually begin. Once you gain control of your character in the bathroom, you're given your first save point. In the first game, these were notebooks where Harry wrote down his personal testimonies, and in the second, they're red blocks, representing Mary's letter. But for Heather, they are the halo of the sun symbol, and they hurt her head much in the same way the red squares hurt James. It's external circles that have perimeters fixed with images connected with at least one of a sum of 8 components that comprise a necessary piece of the cosmology in the Order's religion, the 3 principal components of steel, blood, and light. Also, the 5 lesser components of fire, air, water, earth, and wood. But this video is not about this, so I'm pretty much just gonna leave that be. You can research that on your own time. It should be noted that the symbol itself represents both the death and birth simultaneously, and here it's used as a means of saving and loading, but it's also implied that each time Heather looks at it, she gains memories of her past life. This could be why the very first one is placed on a mirror. Another thing I took note of was her reaction upon trying to interact with the mirror. She states that she doesn't like mirrors, feeling as if the person reflected isn't actually her. It's a subtle indication of her identity crisis, but also how deeply insecure she is. Given the conditions of her birth, it's very easy for her to feel confused at who she really is. Upon sneaking your way out of the bathroom window in order to get away, you find yourself trapped in an alleyway because some asshole parked their van right at the end somehow. I mean, I figured she could just climb on top of it, but I guess she won't do that. Anyway, going into a nearby window takes you to a different part of the mall, where the music finally subsides. Silent Hill 3 probably has the most replay value out of all of them. Much like Silent Hill 2, this game has 3 different difficulty modes for both the combat and the puzzles, but on top of that, items appear based on how much stuff you're carrying and what difficulty you happen to be playing on. Also, the hard mode makes a few extra changes, like making Heather bump into walls and whatnot, just to add an extra element of pressure when being chased after by monsters, which is something I genuinely appreciate about this game compared to the last 2. Though there were some of these elements in Silent Hill 2, I just think that because of the much more refined combat in this one, the hard mode here is way better than it was in the previous game. Like, Silent Hill 1's hard mode was fine, but the controls were already pretty janky, so it was challenging enough to just try playing it on normal. There's nothing fun about dealing with all those shitty pterodactyl monsters or the kids with knives, but many of the boss fights and so on were pretty fun. Silent Hill 2's hard mode is actually terrible, and that is primarily the fault of Maria and the missions where you have to escort her. Plus, with the unique aesthetic of Silent Hill 2, it would just be better to play it on normal anyways and embrace the atmosphere. Silent Hill 3 kind of perfected the combat, and now hard mode actually feels rewardingly challenging in a way that isn't just broken. Monsters are much more threatening this time around, and the player is given many more obstructions between point A and point B. Every boss fight is extremely unique and genuinely horrifying as opposed to just being a floating box with feet. James is fucking weird. Upon making your way through the mall, Heather pretty much stumbles into Silent Hill by complete accident. She finds a gun and happens to come across a closer feasting on a corpse. These monsters are bizarre and intimidating, almost feeling like a mockery of the female form. The mouth is shaped like lips, so I'm not going to elaborate on what precisely they were cooking here, but it also has pussies for hands, as well as a miniskirt, very similar to that of Heather's. Their gigantic size typically makes running through hallways a challenge, hence why they're called closers. and also why they're usually in very small rooms. I believe this symbolizes Heather's struggle with self-image, and its large size could also indicate her fear of growing up, and the changes happening to her body. But much of the symbolism in this title also correlates a lot with Alessa's story as well, like the big arms probably correlating with the abuse that Alessa was forced to endure. Plus, this model was based off of Angela, and with the various references to Silent Hill 2, as well as the fact that she was also a victim of abuse, I believe that its intention might lean more towards that. Plus, these monsters bear a striking resemblance to the Mandarin. As far as I can tell, the justification for why both of these monsters look alike mainly exists as a way of establishing the town of Silent Hill's consistency among different people. While no two people see the same monsters unless directly influenced by them, there is a consistent through line as far as the way these monsters are designed goes. You don't actually get to kill this one because it dies in the cutscene, which is a bit puzzling to me given the first enemy interaction in both the first and second games respectively was completely different. I also want to point out the slight guilt Heather feels after killing it, and that does give some weight to a line that is spoken towards the end, but it's implied subtly at times that these might not actually be monsters at all. Upon making your way to the door on the other side and progressing onward, you eventually run right into the map, and holy Jesus fuck, this place is huge. The consistent theme of Silent Hill 3's gameplay has been to overwhelm the player much in the same way that Heather feels overwhelmed by her situation, which is what makes this game so much different. First fucking area in the game is a mall. It's like a huge mall, and your presence is so tiny and meaningless that it can feel very oppressive at times. And that is what is known as a liminal space, a large abandoned area meant to invoke a sense of unease. Many of the areas in Silent Hill 2 felt claustrophobic to symbolize James' entrapment, but here it's a hell of a lot more intimidating to emphasize the crushing burden of teenhood, having your whole life ahead of you and so on. In any case, the only place you can necessarily go is upstairs, where you encounter what is known as a numb body. This cute little clumsy tadpole sperm-looking creature is very small and has a hole for a face, and it's underdeveloped, almost looking like a creature that was born prematurely, which might coincide with Heather's existentialism of feeling like she's left incomplete, or maybe it could also correlate with the premature state of God in Heather's womb. These monsters are weak and don't generally do much damage, but typically travel in groups. They're much easier to kill than most of the larger enemies, but a lot of the time when they travel in packs, there really isn't much of a point because they still take 5 bullets each and often at times grow in size, taking even more ammo. That's something about Silent Hill 3 that remains the same. Killing enemies is a lot more trouble than it's worth, and now you're given even more reason to save your bullets due to the various boss fights being given a ridiculous amount of health. As if that wasn't obvious enough, this game also keeps track of how much damage you take, as well as how many monsters you kill, which actually affects the ending you get. Only on replay though, which puts even more weight into every decision you make. When you run past this monster and make your way to the upper level of the mall, you're given 2 more closers to deal with, and the abundance of this enemy perfectly encapsulates my point. They are extremely fucking beefy and take way too many bullets to kill, but to make up for that, they are extremely slow and easy to avoid, and it's good to have an enemy like that early on so the player can pick up on this philosophy pretty fast. In any case, you want to make your way to the bakery, where you can find some tongs that will help you grab a pair of keys hidden under a wooden pallet. There's a doorway on the way back that leads you to some beef jerky, which is guarded by a double head. It's like a dog with its head split open, and it adds to the hellish imagery of Silent Hill, what with their split head resembling that of Cerberus from mythology, but this obviously falls in line with what was present in the first Silent Hill, where those enemies symbolize Alessa's fear of dogs. But these are a bit more grotesque, looking as if they had been burned alive and wearing bandages, again directly correlating with the fact that Alessa was nothing more than the Order's pet and was burned alive. At the same time, I also think the split head symbolizes the duality between Alessa and Heather and how it's kind of tearing her apart. In any case, they're very tough and fast, and when they see you, they usually howl, which always scares the ever-loving fuck out of me. Plus, with this one residing in an enclosed space, it's in the player's best interest to run in, grab the item, and quickly get out of there as fast as they can. The beef jerky is a very unique item. It's kind of just here to distract monsters, but I don't end up using them very much until the hospital, in which case they are highly recommended. When you do make it to the end of this hallway and grab the keys with the tongs, you hear some thudding outside, only to find that now the area is completely ripe with more of those numb body enemies. And this is something that will happen a lot in this game, where certain decisions the player makes each impact the world around them, either by spawning enemies or killing the player. It gives the world of Silent Hill some believability. In any case, you want to make your way to the bookstore, where you run into a pretty simple puzzle. In it, you basically match some books together, which give you the code to the nearby door. On easy and normal, it works by placing the books together to see what it says. The puzzles do get more complicated than this, but I think it's alright to ease players into it by starting off with something simplistic. The answer is right there next to the doorway, so the player isn't left confused, unless they pick the hard puzzle mode, where apparently they have to actually, know literature to even figure out how to solve it. You can make your way through the door where you're given a cutscene, and this is where Heather meets Claudia. This eyebrowless woman is the main antagonist of our story, as well as the successor of Dahlia Gillespie from the first game. She intends to birth God with Heather's womb, having her follow in the footsteps of Alessa, whom she was reincarnated from. By birthing God, she intends to create a new world, believing that to be the answer. I'll have a lot more to say about her as we go, but the point is that her delusional mindset makes her an active threat, and it seems that even being close to her puts Heather in immense pain. I think what I like about Claudia as a villain to this story is that it gives the game this opportunity to implement several different themes. Puberty and the scary world of womanhood is definitely something that comes up several times, but religion and its over-reliance on purity is also something that adds to that. Much in the same way that Heather is urged to birth God, women are urged to be mothers and housewives. Heather might be objectified in a slightly different way, but I think it's something that a lot of women who play this game might relate to. I think Claudia, as well as the Order, are meant to somewhat correlate with the way that purity and religion affect women as they grow up. How the normalization of traditional values often silences women and forces them into roles they're meant to play without their consent or say in the matter. Silent Hill is no stranger to addressing misogyny, but it goes all out in this game, and that's something I'll continue to touch on as I make my way through it. In any case, you finally get your radio, which is also underwhelming given we're well over half an hour into this game. It's a bit odd you weren't given this tool alongside your first monster like in the last two games. It's treated more like an invitation card to Silent Hill, especially since you end up in the other world once the elevator opens up, with weird groaning sounds, metal creaking, and what looks like some kind of weird demon orgy going on nearby. Then, without warning, you're dropped into this rusty hallway where there are double heads fucking everywhere. The nearest save point is right down the hall, so you're still at threat of getting hit before you even make it there, but from this point forward, the game descends further and further into hell in a way that I honestly respect. The items in this game are mostly the exact same as they were in other titles. Health drinks, which heal you a little bit, med kits, which heal you a lot, as well as ampules, which heal you a lot on top of temporarily upgrading your durability and speed, which is quite useful for bosses. As is typical Silent Hill tradition, they're limited, and you want to keep whichever ones you find in your possession for as long as you can. It's already a tightly woven system that forces the player to avoid combat as much as they can, but now with the items being different depending on what difficulty or what items the player holds at that moment, there's an added layer of complexity in how the player makes each individual decision, because now the playthrough is almost guaranteed to be different every time you play, and it's even harder to go strictly off of a guide given the variations. It couldn't be more clear that difficulty is a priority in Silent Hill 3, and I respect it for that a lot. Upon making your way through the mall, now infested with enemies, you'll eventually come across a room containing a flashlight, and the game also urges you to turn off the light so you can test it out. In similar fashion to the previous games, this one is also very helpful for dodging enemies, as they won't pursue you if you turn it off. Most of the time, at least. In the room next to it, there's also the same bathroom that you were in beforehand, only this time it's overrun with rust and decay. Also, there's a stall door you can knock on that knocks back, but as soon as you go to leave, it opens up revealing that there's nobody in there, just a giant bloodstain. Another one of those subtle scares that creep the player out, which also emphasize Silent Hill's ability to scare without relying on enemies or the radio. But what's also funny about this room is that the stall right next to it contains an Easter egg. I referenced it earlier, but if you played Silent Hill 2 on the same memory card and interact with this toilet, Heather will say this.
Oh, forget it. This is way too gross. Who would even think of doing something so disgusting?
It's so funny to me how a game as depressing and creepy as Silent Hill still tries to throw in some humor here and there. They didn't need to include this, but they did anyway, and it really gives the game a unique personality. In any case, the player will eventually come across a ladder hanging from the ceiling that Heather can't reach on her own, and it's pretty standard for a Silent Hill game, a roadblock that you take a mental note of for later so you can continue exploring all across this mall for what might be the answer. Upon heading back to the room you were at before, you'll actually find a bulletproof vest, which halves the damage done to you by enemies. This thing is super helpful for boss fights, but it does make you much slower, which I think is a fair trade. Roaming the halls of the mall is very treacherous and very unwelcoming compared to previous titles. I managed to get away with killing lots of enemies in the last two, but here, there's just so fucking much thrown at you that it really isn't worth the hassle at all. Along with it, you'll also find a hanger, which is like the perfect tool to use on that ladder from earlier. Upon making your way up here, you're in a darker part of the mall with an empty room barren of life. It's pitch black, with the only sound present coming from the TV static nearby. And if the player inspects it, they get a subtle glimpse of Cheryl from the first game. There will be a lot of connections to both Silent Hill 1 and 2 in order to reinforce what both games set out to do and how both games are still part of the same universe, despite having different intentions. Anyway, upon making your way upstairs, there is a poem that the player might have trouble reading due to the closer nearby. There are many points where an enemy's placement will unfortunately force the player's hand, although this particular enemy can be cheesed by using the nearby escalator. In any case, the poem on the door is quite cryptic, and it's affiliated with a crescent shape. Piling up the 300th day and night from beyond the door, cries of pain are heard, and the final destination has become real, though not a blessed beginning. I personally interpret this poem's line about 300 days as referencing the 9 months of pregnancy before childbirth. The mention of the final destination could mean that the now living child has already been given an expiration date. From the moment you're born, your death is already set in stone. Anything but a blessed beginning. This nihilistic message probably correlates in some way with the fact that Heather was born in this town, so it could also be referring to the fact that her journey back to this place was inevitable, which is interesting given the town still affects her even when she isn't quite there yet. No matter what she does, she cannot escape it. The image of a moon works to build this point as well, serving as a symbol of time as it embodies the cycle. It's in various different phases, which both represents Heather's reincarnation on top of how much she's grown, but beyond just that, this particular moon crescent is left as an empty husk, very reminiscent of Heather herself. Anyway, you can't really do anything with this door just yet, so we actually have to go into the nearby room and grab a key from the stomach of a charred doublehead. It's a disturbing image, likely correlating with Heather's predicament, as dogs symbolize loyalty, although I think this also might be a reference to Alessa. She was a young girl who was loyal to her mother and only ended up burning alive at her hand. In any case, this key will open up various other parts of the mall, and it also gets you the steel pipe. Upon further exploration, there are various pits where the player is at threat of falling over if they get knocked down by nearby enemies, which can cause an instant death. This is a brand new mechanic, and it makes the janky controls all the more stressful to fight with. As indicated by the roller coaster segment in your dream, there are various moments where the player will be put at risk of being insta-killed, even on normal mode, and I definitely appreciate that. This area has more of those pendulums from the dream sequence as well. Of course, the creator of this monster states that they don't have any special meaning and he just made them to be scary, but fuck you, I'm going to analyze them anyway. Given the themes of womanhood and the monster's constant pursuit, as well as the fact that they chase after you no matter what elevation you're at, I think penetration might play a part in their symbolism here. Misogyny and violence, especially sexual violence, are big themes in this story, so it isn't out of the question to assume that most of the monsters are meant to symbolize Heather's distrust of men, as well as the general fear of existing as a woman. Plus, being called pendulums due to their rhythmic motion might also have to do with time. I think Heather might be feeling existential, realizing now that her time on this earth is limited, forcing her to come to terms with her mortality, but I also think she's genuinely terrified of giving birth herself, which, given the Order's insistence that she birth gods, makes a lot of sense. Anyway, at a certain point in the mall, you should have picked up some bleach and detergent, both of which are just laying around somewhere. The player is given a few puzzles before they can progress onward. There's a roadblock of moths flying around that will damage the player if they get too close, and in order to kill them, you need to mix these two and make chlorine.
I combined 2 common items in a powerful new way. I told my readers to harness the cleaning power of ammonia with the whitening power of bleach.
Ammonia and bleach? You told people to mix ammonia and bleach?
Only if they want bathroom fixtures that shine like the sun.
Peggy, that's the recipe for mustard gas.
One thing I find interesting about this puzzle is that in normal mode, Heather will not go back into the room without turning the fan on to air it out, but on hard mode, you don't get a warning. She'll just go right in there and potentially die of poisoning. This game does not give a shit about you. It will fuck with you in any way that it can, which is made even more obvious by the ungodly moans in the distance. Making your way to the complete other side of the mall takes you to a vise that serves no purpose unless the player found the single walnut way earlier, just kind of sitting there. Once again, keeping up that custom of random fucking items being just picked up whenever you find them. It doesn't help either that the jewel inside the walnut is to the door way back at the complete other side of this floor. Pair this with enemies spawning where they weren't beforehand and you just can't catch a break. It genuinely goes above and beyond to make sure that you never feel safe or comfortable. Anyway, this jewel opens the door from earlier, which takes you to the ladder that will lead you straight to the first boss of the game, the Split Worm. Considering I've been breaking down the sexual themes of the story, I think this one's kind of self-explanatory. Worms correlate once again with the imagery from the first Silent Hill, that being Alessa's fear of worms and bugs. The vaginal head looks a lot like the split-head dogs, but this one's also a double entendre, because while the head looks vaginal in shape, the monster itself is very phallic. And this is further reinforced by the fact that it goes in and out of various holes. I think Heather is both scared of men and just scared of sex in general, which is understandable given how much of a commitment it is for a woman. But on top of that, its emergence from its hiding place could also correlate with the themes of childbirth, how Heather was born into this town, but also how terrified she is of giving birth to God, and for good reason. Childbirthing is painful. So this sheds a lot more light into what that poem from earlier meant, and why it was attached to this door specifically. Mechanically, this fight is the first get good moment in Silent Hill 3, as you're basically playing whack-a-mole. The player is given the option to waste ammo on it, but this won't do you much good since it has the ability to smash the ground and damage you from a distance. So the player is better off utilizing close-range combat, and at that point, it's all about timing. You have a block that lasts like 2 seconds, almost like a parry. It's a small window of invincibility, and if the player fails to time it just right, then they're knocked on their ass for way longer than they should be. Which I find funny, because it's like Heather is just so offended by what just happened to her, she just needs to lay down for a second and process it. Anyway, the boss is very unique, and served as the first moment where this particular title's gameplay philosophy clicked with me, and I started realizing why I like it more than Silent Hill 2. While that game had a beautiful atmosphere and story, this one's combat is so insane and intense that I just can't help but love it. Before we move on, there is one little thing I forgot to mention, and that would be a strange cutscene that happens when you die in a certain room at the mall. This weird creature, making creepily excited noises, grabs Heather by her legs and drags her away as she is corrupted by red spots, much in the same way she does later on in the game, but I'm not going to touch on that just yet. I think the weird noises he makes, as well as the way he grabs her and pulls her away, says all that it needs to with the running theme of erotophobia. However, the theory people have about this is definitely still weird and sexual, but just not in the way you think. That would be Voltiel, who serves as an in-universe explanation for why you respawn in this game when you die. He is basically God's attendant and does this strictly for you because your job is to birth God, so he's preserving your womb for that very purpose. Weird and uncomfortable, but at least he makes sure you don't die for good. His garb resembles that of a surgeon, which again correlates to childbirth. You do see him a few times throughout the game, but I figured I might as well talk about him now, because while he doesn't add much to the game, it's still worth mentioning. Anyway, the mall goes back to normal, and the player is given the task of going home without a map. After encountering Douglas once again, who seems just as confused as you are, but apparently also got to see some Silent Hill monsters, Heather decides she'll go home by herself on the subway. I always wonder what other characters see when they're in this town, because the experience actually is different for everyone, although mechanically I also wonder if maybe the monsters that Heather sees are something that everyone sees, since that seemed to be the case in the first game. Like, without the curse of Alessa or the Order's spell, then the town is given the freedom to change up monsters depending on a person's trauma, though I highly doubt that's the case. I genuinely think that it is just a different experience for each and every character, and that the town is too powerful to exclusively be influenced by the presence of one person, but it's open to interpretation. The mechanics are laid out for the player, but still very subtle and nuanced. The subway is an interesting area, as it's very short, but somewhat confusing with its layout. You can read a newspaper about a man who got pushed onto the train track and killed, which serves as a soft warning for what ends up happening to you a bit later. Noting the excited growls from the creature, it's obviously another element to consider when analyzing the theme of violence against women and fear of being stalked. He just sounds like he's busting a nut, and you know he pushed her with one hand. Anyway, the jump scare puts the player in a very compromising position where they're forced to quickly climb back up unless they desire a game over. Small moments of tension like that are very frequent, where the player is put into a difficult situation and forced to think fast. And that's definitely something that Silent Hill 3 has over the last 2 games. There are lots of points where the player is at risk of dying that don't actually involve enemies at all. Not to say that the last 2 games didn't ever do that, but certainly not as much. Upon making your way further and running past some double heads and the like, the player eventually comes across a body that Heather seems to be desensitized to, believing that the nightmare is starting to make her numb to it. And this plays a part in what I consider to be the bad ending, but I'll get to that later. For now, there's a nutcracker in the room opposite to this one, which you can use to break a rusty chain holding a door shut. Progressing onward spawns enemies in this room, serving as a subtle scare that might make the player uneasy. It's a nice way to take away what little security the player can find in this area, while also emphasizing that this is truly the point of no return. Making your way onto the train earns you the shotgun, which is my preferred weapon most of the time. Upon heading back out, you run into what is known as an insane cancer. They're even slower than the closers, but serve the same purpose as their massive size makes them a pain when navigating the thin hallways and small rooms. They're also even beefier than closers, so killing them is generally pretty pointless. Adding to the theme of stalker behavior, it's telling that slower enemies work to obstruct your ability to progress forward, but I also think these insane cancers are perhaps a reference to body horror in pregnancy, what with their big size. Women are often dehumanized when they gain weight, even though becoming pregnant literally guarantees that they do. On top of that, though, this particular monster might also be emblematic of the disease growing inside Heather's womb, but also Alessa's feelings of self-hatred, seeing herself as a disease that just won't stay dead. The further into the subway you get, the more chaotic and uninviting it becomes. One thing about the design of these games that I respect is how often it feels like the town itself is trying to communicate to you. Like here, where walking towards this side of the track angles the camera where you can see a red door, but upon trying to open it, you're bombarded with 3 double heads and a train coming for you really fast. Another moment of pressure completely unprompted, as if punishing the player for exploring, and this is what spawns the train, an area that I genuinely like a lot. It's the most linear part of the game, but not without its own eerie twist. You essentially run down a subway link by link, while occasionally encountering enemies that progressively get more intimidating the further in you go. Usually just numb bodies and like one insane cancer, which is much more of a threat given the limited space. Of course, every time you progress forward in the train, the area behind you disappears for good, once again reinforcing that theme of no return. When the train arrives home, you make your way through the underpass containing a bunch of tight corridors with a combination of all the different enemies you've seen thus far. This game is insanely detailed this time around, with Heather having something to say about literally fucking everything, like this bloody locker that makes weird pig noises when you examine it. She wants to open it because of her morbid curiosity, but ultimately decides against it. This is also the room where you find the maul or fucking mace, which is one of my favorite close-range weapons. It's insanely heavy for Heather, so it's very slow and difficult to use against faster enemies like double heads, but it is quite useful for boss fights and slower enemies like insane cancers or closers. And it's basically this game's version of the giant knife from the previous game. It's the strongest close-range weapon, but it definitely makes you vulnerable and easy to hit. The underpass is a pretty standard area without much in the way of depth, but it maintains the same uninviting atmosphere of the subway with creaking metal and distant screaming everywhere you go. There's also a big room that has nothing in it but a bunch of enemies, which serves as another misleading trap that the player might fall victim to if they play this the way they did the last 2 games. It couldn't be more obvious that Silent Hill 3 wants to fuck with you, especially if you're a fan of those last 2 titles. In any case, you want to pick up a wine bottle from a box where there's a dead corpse underneath, and fill it up with oil from this machine you find in the save room, which is just kerosene for the fuel tank that gets rid of the body of water blocking you from progressing through the sewers. I don't have much to say about this area, aside from how easy it is to cheese most of the enemies. There is a subtle cameo of what looks like a scraper, though it's a bit hard to make out. It's the boss fight that you're about to encounter really soon. When you backtrack here, it's completely gone, which is very unsettling, but you'll get to fight it in due time. It always feels like you're being watched in this game, even in moments where you're completely alone. There's a hairdryer, which serves as a puzzle piece for a roadblock you encounter later. Remember those bloodsucker things from Silent Hill? I find it interesting that Harry just bypassed them by accommodating it with blood, but in the case of Heather, she just casually tosses the hairdryer into the water and electrocutes it to death. I also have to appreciate that you only get a warning for this monster in easy and normal mode respectively, but hard mode just kills you without mercy. For the first half of this game, it can be hard to tell what's part of the nightmare and what's real, especially if you explore the hilltop center, like the legs you find behind this wall as an example. We've already seen 2 corpses as is, but Heather still wishes she hadn't seen it. This is also the most dead, silent area we've seen thus far, save for the occasional banging noise that sends a chill down my spine no matter how many times I play this game. In any case, there is a hole the player needs to jump down to progress, though they need to drop a mattress down before doing so, or else they'll trigger a death. I want to talk about this particular area because mannequins serve as an interesting bit of symbolism, adding further to the theme of self-image. Mannequins are usually displayed for fashion and body standards. However, the ones here don't have heads, and the only one that does gets decapitated as soon as the player walks away from it, with real blood oozing from its neck. I don't want to read too deeply into it, but it is an interesting moment, albeit very brief regardless. There's also a room where you can find a katana, my personal favorite close-ranged weapon. It's fast and always my go-to when conserving ammo as it has a lot of leverage. Of course, this is all optional. The real goal is to try and get inside this elevator where the door is only open an inch. Making your way to the top of the building will take you to the jack, which you'll then use on this elevator door to open it up. You also need to find a screwdriver where you can open up a drawer that gives you a rope. There's many layers to the puzzles this time around, and that's almost contradictory. Considering how often this particular title loves punishing you for exploring, it's also impossible to progress without doing so, as is typical to Silent Hill tradition. Anyway, this is where you make your way back to the other world by interacting with a bathtub that bleeds. You're back in the other world, and you're even greeted by freakish images of mouths and ears pinned up on a blurry crucified corpse. It feels very Lynchian, especially with the weird noises it makes.
Last chance to look at me, actor.
The imagery is much more bizarre than it was last time, almost difficult to make out. The baby dolls obviously add to the symbolism regarding pregnancy and childbirth, though there is this one corpse that appears to be holding a pair of scissors in one hand and a baby in the other, and normally I'd interpret this sort of stuff, but you kind of lost me here. It's so bafflingly strange, I don't have much else to say about it besides perhaps a mother being weighed down by her child. Anyway, upon exploring the area further, you'll meet this guy whose name is Vincent Smith. He feels like this game's version of Kaufman from the first one. You know, a generally unsympathetic and shitty person who's actually completely on your side. To put it plainly, Claudia believes in God, and believes in his salvation being good for the planet. She thinks that by birthing God, the world will change for the better. He also believes in God and his salvation, but does not think the way she's birthing God is really going to create a utopia. Partially because of how grisly her methods are, but also because of how much of a detrimental effect it will likely have on the world. But even despite being your ally, this guy's a fucking weirdo. Like, he loves mocking you and repeatedly jabbing at your insecurities. He even makes a comment about your dad, whom you played as in the first game. He also isn't terrified by this place at all. Like, he likes it and finds it interesting, which makes me wonder what he sees. Also, he seems to really like the sound of his own voice and gets mad at Heather for walking away and finding him weird and off-putting. This is the perfect opportunity to talk about the most frustrating enemy in this game, the fucking slurpers. I hate these things so much. These little buggers crawl across the floor and grab onto your leg, sometimes knocking you down and making it extremely hard to navigate simple hallways. Pair that with the often claustrophobic level design, as well as the fact that they apparently travel in fucking packs, and you have the ingredients for what is easily my least favorite enemy in Silent Hill. You can, of course, distract them with beef jerky, but it's quite nauseating to kill them with close-range weaponry a lot of the time, so I end up shooting them. They're not like other enemies where you can pretty much get away with ignoring them, because doing so is practically impossible. Granted, I typically play this game on hard mode, so I can't speak for how annoying they are on other difficulties, but I just had to vent. Especially because of how much damage they do, and the obnoxious amount of health they have. As far as symbolism goes, these ones are a lot to take in. They look like naked men, and with the fact that they knock you to the floor and climb on top of you, yeah, how do you not get it already? Like, the theme of maternity and womanliness remains consistent through just about every monster, but another interpretation, and one that I find a little bit more disturbing, could be that the slurpers are symbolic of children. At one point in the game, you see confirmation that Heather is a babysitter and already deals with irritating children, so the clinginess of these monsters might also correlate with that as well, as if they clutch onto you the way a child clutches onto their mother. It couldn't be more obvious that she isn't ready to be a teenage mom. She's too young, inexperienced, and afraid. Plus, with how they crawl around like babies, this is also a definite possibility. I honestly think that both interpretations are true at the same time, and that's something about these games that I really love. Every bit of symbolism has so many layers to it that they aren't just confined to one meaning, especially since we have to account for both Heather and Alessa. Everything in these games feels intentional and purposeful, and it is just fantastic storytelling. In any case, taking the elevator down will lead you to...
What the fuck is that?
Yep, that's the glutton. It's not really hostile towards the player, but the radio flips the fuck out upon sensing it, although its meaning is practically given away to the player with a fairy tale that you're made to read. In spite of its apparently unhostile nature, the glutton's expulsion is compulsory to permit Heather to pass through. I'll talk more about it later. For now, you want to grab this ammo hiding conspicuously behind a sleeping insane cancer, and maybe grab that liver out of the bloody fridge, then make your way back up. Now, whenever you pass through any of the hallways, you're typically bombarded with doubleheads and slurpers, the two fastest enemies in the game, and an unfortunate combination. In one of the rooms are a matchbook and some cigarettes that Heather refuses to take because she quit for good. I think it's safe to say that she's under a lot of stress and definitely a rebellious child. Plus, it's been pretty clear up until now that she does not take good care of herself at all. In any case, this matchbook, liver, and the oxidol you found from exploring this area are all components of a small puzzle regarding this painting of what looks like a witch being burned in a Puritan town. The text underneath it says the following: "Flame purifies all. By these remains may a person find the road to paradise." The inclusion of a witch trial is interesting, as it correlates the actions of the order with the actions of those Puritans back in the late 1600s, burning someone alive for the sake of their god. Noting the theme of misogyny as well, the Salem witch trials were almost entirely motivated by these types of biases. It was a time of paranoia and fear, and many women were needlessly killed over it. But not only does this text and image work as a narrative tool, but it also tells you basically to figure out how to burn it down in order to proceed forward. These three completely random and arbitrary tools, each of which guarantee the player has to scour the entire area and walk past those slurpers over and over unless they make the effort of killing them. This is genuinely the most stressful game in the series, and I'm just gonna say it, it's fucking scarier than Silent Hill 2. Don't get me wrong, fantastic game, but that's just where I stand. This one is just anxiety incarnate. There's even this one part that actually made me fucking scream, because your radio isn't going off at all, and upon inspecting the bed... It is psychological torture every step of the fucking way. There are hallways that only have a couple enemies, but spawn more behind you after you pass a certain point. One of the items you find is a silver coin, which is useful for a vending machine that gives you a key rather than a drink. What a fucking ripoff. Anyway, this key takes you to the last and final segment of the fairy tale, which is a straightforward story about a monster that keeps eating people before a priestess says some magical words that get rid of the monster. Seeing as how this weird roadblock symbolizes that monster, Heather saying these words seems to not only get rid of it, but kill all the remaining ones, which was a hell of a relief for me. Claudia sees Harry as a beast for taking her cherished companion Alessa away from her, and this is obviously when Claudia jokingly says Harry's name to Douglas Cartland. The demonstration of killing the beast in the fantasy obviously must be done. This unequivocally connects with Claudia's inclinations towards Harry, who she accepts should be killed to birth God, thus creating a peaceful world for everybody. Anyway, now it's finally time to go home and make your way to your apartment. I don't have much to say about this segment apart from how calm it is leading up to the moment you find out your dad has been killed. It's a good way to disarm the player by giving them a quick breather to take in the silence, and it's almost comforting in a way. But it is the calm before the inevitable storm. Upon finding the corpse of your dad, you're urged to go upstairs and you end up discovering that it was Claudia. It's easier to hate this woman now, especially since he was the protagonist of the first game, so now it feels a lot more personal for both you and the main lead. I think overall it works pretty well, even if it isn't a super strong motivation. I'm invested just enough that I do want to kill this obnoxious witch. Anyway, this is where you'll fight the missionary, one of the more intimidating enemies. He's a boss fight right now, but eventually becomes a common enemy. Given how consistently each enemy has added to this very same theme, this one might honestly be the most simple. He's a disciple of Claudia and resembles a surgeon. Considering Claudia's goal is to have Heather birth God, I think it's pretty obvious what the purpose of these beasts are. His entire design seems to be a reference to the act of dilation and cutterage, or scraping and scooping the uterus, which is typically to trimester miscarriages or abortions. He has rubber gloves, a mask, and a smock reminiscent of surgical attire, and the long, sharp weapons resemble exaggerated imagery of abortion tools, but it could also have a bit of a phallic meaning. like phallic penetration. But the doctor aesthetic might also have something to do with Alessa and the surgeons that were culpable in her abuse. The boss fight itself is a bit challenging as well, as these monsters are capable of deflecting any front-facing attack. This forces the player to hit them in the back or on each side, but given how dark the area is, turning off your flashlight works to give you the upper hand. If you're playing this on hard mode though, you're given even more of a challenge here, because it's optimal to save as many bullets as you possibly can for the final boss. Like, I'm not kidding. I said something similar in Super Metroid, but I found out that I'm just a stinky idiot who is bad at the video game. But here, it actually is not an exaggeration. I've seen testimonies of the final boss taking like 45 fucking minutes because they give it such an absurd amount of health on hard mode, and that is totally unfair. Anyway, I'll cross that bridge when I get there. The boss fight is actually really cool, because it's the one involving the most running, kind of like a game of tag. You're given enough space to move around effectively, and given his close range, a lot of this boss fight depends on how quick you are. These enemies serve as a much more serious threat when they travel in packs later on in the game.
I'm going to Silent Hill.
Now listen! That's called motherfucking bars, nigga! You know nothing about that!
One thing I want to take note of is how the acting is still very strange and surreal, but still very good. Heather recounts the story of the first game, and shows a lot of love and admiration for her father. It's quite touching, and the song is very nice, almost reminiscent of something out of Silent Hill 2. Douglas is quite supportive now, and definitely a lot less of a weirdo like he was at the start. He almost feels like a mentor, and possibly even a replacement guardian for Harry. It's my headcanon that after the good ending of this game, he actually adopts Heather, which I think might be intentional given the information we're shown later on. Anyway, for now it's time to head to the hospital, because every single Silent Hill game needs to have one, apparently. I also appreciate that this game offers us notes that Harry left about. There's one here, but there's also a room much later in the game that contains a notebook that previously worked as a save point in the first game, where you're given a heartfelt message from your dad in which he admits that part of him hated you and wanted to abandon you, but that he overcame these feelings and figured out how to care for you the same way he did Cheryl. When Heather first appeared in his life, he had lost his original daughter, an experience that was probably traumatizing for him since this wasn't the first time he lost a child, and he had lost a wife as well. So to be given this replacement baby from the very town that took your daughter away just feels honestly cruel, and it's understandable why these moments of darkness sometimes crept up on him, but he never let them consume him, nor dictate his actions. He still pushed through, and found a way to love his daughter despite everything, and that's what makes his death so crushing, because it's not just a loss for Heather, but the player that beat the first game as well. The character you spend time controlling, the journey you went on, that was all yours, and to see him die is genuinely sad. I know that some people might not like that this game chooses to tie 1 and 2 together rather than talk about an entirely different story, but I just don't agree with this notion. In particular, that Eye Patch Wolf video bugs the shit out of me, and I think at some point I might make a response to it, but in the meantime we're just going to focus on appreciating this beautiful game. Not to say I don't love the guy's content, I'm just not a fan of this one video in particular. Anyway, upon leaving this room, you get to be right where you were in the last game. Like, I'm not even fucking kidding, this area was present in the previous title. You can't really go to any of the buildings, like Pete's Bolorama or the Blue Creek apartment, but the fact that they included Rosewater Park and even Heaven's Night, just as a nice little Easter egg, makes me really appreciate this world that these games have built. It doesn't feel like it's just thrown in as a cheap way of cashing in on the success of Silent Hill 2, like the remake or the fact that Pyramid Head shows up in Homecoming. It's more just here to further emphasize that these games are interconnected and that the journeys of Harry and James both took place in the same town, even though they had different intentions and experiences. It's less fan service and more just lore and connecting threads that, in my opinion, richen the experience. Also, the hospital you go to is the exact same one James went to, with the layout even being exactly the same. However, the contents and puzzles are much different, especially since now the dungeon is much longer and has a lot more going for it. As is typical Silent Hill tradition, we have to have sexy nurse ladies that want to kill you, because why the fuck not? These ones even carry guns sometimes, which is kind of cartoony and silly and a little hard to take seriously. This particular rendition of the nurse enemy is interesting because it's essentially a mixture of the ones from the first game and the ones from the second, but for different reasons. In the first, they were possessed, mindless zombies, forced to move against their will. And that made sense because everyone involved in the abuse of Alessa was forced into it by the Order. In Silent Hill 2, they symbolize James' sexual desires due to his frustration. But in Silent Hill 3, I think there's a bit more to consider. It was pretty much confirmed that many of these nurses are a reference to Lisa Garland, which makes sense since the audio clip of her talking about Alessa's burning body is repeated here.
Still have an unusual high fever. Eyes don't open. Getting a pulse, but just barely breathing. Why? What is keeping that child alive?
One thing I think would have been interesting would be for these nurses to have more of a bubblehead-esque design, as it would fit the symbolic theme of sexualization and body standards and whatnot. In fact, you could constantly pair them up with insane cancers in order to have that sort of dissonance between what women are told they're meant to look like versus what is demonized. I'm not entirely sure if there was an intention for that, because their design really isn't all that sexualized compared to the previous title. That being said, I also want to mention the red square on their mouth. This is a small reference to all those creepy mouth and ear pictures we've been seeing pop up left and right, which symbolize Alessa's screams falling onto deaf ears. The red is meant to reflect Alessa's charred skin. But with the hospital, much of the creepy aspects of stalking and so on become a lot more intimately displayed. Throughout this entire dungeon, you run into several journal entries from Stanley Coleman, each of which are love letters to Heather. You never actually see the guy, which further adds to the eeriness given how strong his presence is, which I think is the perfect summary for what this game is actually all about. It's someone we don't know that Heather is deeply uncomfortable with, because he talks in these letters like you're his soulmate, and he hasn't even gotten to know you yet. Kinda reminds me of that whole Bjork assassination attempt, which was fucking insane. Each of these journal entries come with a creepy doll that Heather refuses to touch, and I really don't fucking blame her. Like, it's so fucking gross. He has this weird display of things he puts on the wall that the player needs to take a key from in order to get to the stairwell. His journal entries start to get a lot worse as you proceed onward, like this one that seems to talk as if romanticizing a double suicide by jumping off the hospital roof. You also have a nice little Silent Hill 2 reference where Heather states that it doesn't look like she'll fall over the way James did in the last game. She is just so brutal to this man, and she's never even met him. It is so funny. Anyway, the puzzles in this particular dungeon are a return to form. Pretty standard stuff. You unlock a door with a poem that gives you a confusingly vague description of the numbers, and you deduce what these numbers are by the information you're given. And it's not thematically relevant, but it's a fun little brain teaser. However, on the hard mode version of this puzzle, it is disturbing as all hell. Adding to all those creepy stalker notes you read throughout the dungeon, one of them is a confession from a man to a woman that he wishes to kiss her, but also wants to hurt her. It's overtly threatening and sadistic, even despite the warm, lovey-dovey words used to soften it up, which I think is properly emblematic of the caution that women have of men. Like, at this point, if you aren't aware of what this game is trying to say, there really is no saving you. Visiting the women's locker room gets you the nail polish and perfume that allows you to take a key off of a wall. There's another puzzle which involves you translating the time on a clock to a code on a safe, which gets you an instant camera that you'll be using to take a picture of a code sitting behind a shelf. Right before finding it, you come across the aftermath of some crazy murder scene. It should also be noted that this area is completely blocked off from James, which I think is pretty fascinating. Anyway, this number combination will take you to that row of hospital rooms, S1 through S14. Although, again, in typical Silent Hill fashion, you can only really visit 3 of these rooms. One of which has a lengthy explanation about the Order and their awful practices, another of which depicts the breaking point of your stalker, who has officially lost his mind and broken the doll, claiming that Leonard Wolf foiled his plans to come see you, and the last of which also gives you a chance to speak with Leonard Wolf, who shows clear disagreement with Claudia's actions, and even seems like a potential ally. But given his tone and the unhinged way he speaks of his daughter, it's clear that he might have been severely abusive towards her, starting with the fact that he can't even seem to recognize his own daughter's voice. But the way he speaks of her, and the fact that he considers her a lost cause, shows that he holds nothing in his heart but disdain. This particular hallway likes to fuck with you by being completely empty until the player walks past a certain point, only to then be bombarded with enemies, further adding to the sense of unease all over this game. But from this point forward, the rest of this dungeon is an absolute nightmare. You're given directions to the next area you're meant to head towards, which is this strange room that doesn't fit in with the hospital at all. You almost begin to wonder if maybe you're in an entirely new area as you head through this maze with doors opening and closing as you get close to them. You don't have a map for this part of the area either, so much of the time you're just winging it and taking guesses. It's so claustrophobic and nauseating with the camera angles and repetitive sound effects, but what's even worse is that dead silence. Soon after, the player is made to climb up a ladder, with another picture of Alessa's tortured grin, soon followed up by a monster spinning some kind of wheel and angling him at just the convenient spot to be able to look up Heather's skirt. Yeah, I don't need to elaborate on what this means. Then from this point forward, things just get progressively worse. The rooms are all red and disjointed with blurry pictures and bloody floors. It's emetic and dizzying, with many of the rooms being hard to even read as a room given the walls and floors all blend together. Also, this part of the dungeon is filled to the absolute fucking brim with not just nurses, but more of those slurper monsters from before that I hate with every fiber of my being. It should also be noted that once you enter this door, you can no longer access the ladder, basically establishing this, once again, as the point of no return. You are not going back. We are not backtracking. That is not... There's even this one very memorable room with a mirror that stuck out to me as one of the most unsettling moments of the game. If you remember Heather's feelings of self-loathing and hatred for mirrors, given her existentialism, this room keeps you locked into it until a certain point, forcing you to stay and focus on the mirror where your reflection is slowly consumed by red and black lines that also seem to be engulfing the nearby tub. It makes you look gross and uncanny, which I think correlates with both Heather's struggle with self-image and her existentialism regarding her identity. I also think it's interesting how much of this area just looks bloody, which I'm sure also has to do with menstruation. Anyway, you can finally leave once your reflection stops moving and the entire room is completely engulfed in this dark red substance, but if you stay in here any longer, you will end up dying and getting a game over. The best part about this is that it mechanically adds nothing to the game at all. Like, the dungeon would be fine without it. They really didn't need to include this, but I am so fucking happy that they did, because it's genuinely creepy as hell without having to rely on enemies to make the player uncomfortable. Speaking of uncomfortable, it is theorized in this very room with the hospital beds everywhere that Mr. Coleman is actually laying on bed 7 in this strange room, and upon approaching the bed, he also sounds a little bit excited to see you. The easy mode is extremely bland because there isn't a puzzle, but the normal mode requires the player to memorize where certain beds are relative to a grid, and the hard mode has you decipher poetry written on each individual body. It's a hell of a lot more elaborate with how it's framed, and definitely interesting to take note of, which is something I admire about Silent Hill's puzzles on hard mode. This might genuinely be the most unsettling version of the hospital in a Silent Hill game yet. The distant screams of what sounds like a baby, the heavy thudding, and that weird dark red glass that seems to be reflecting something we can't quite make out. Some weird monster trapped in a locker thrashing about haphazardly with a white robe hung nearby, likely once again correlating with the entrapment that Alessa had to face. But what's more fascinating is the room across from it where you're treated to a phone call from some unhinged stranger who basically tells you that your stalker was murdered by Leonard, all but confirming that the man on bed 7 was him. This is the closest thing in this game resembling the confusing storytelling of the last 2 games, and it left me just as lost as anybody else. The way he talks is threatening and deceitful, but it's propped up with such a harmless and playful tone, playing again into that creepy stalker behavior that makes Heather fear men. He's also exceedingly inconsistent with her age, first calling her 31, which is the age Alessa would be if she were still alive, then calling her 24, which is the age Cheryl Mason would be if she were still alive. But beyond that, I don't think there's much more meaning behind what he says here. He's just generally pretty unhinged, though it seems like his quote about giving pain or receiving it refers to the birth of God. His fixation on her birthday might have to do with the gift that Harry gave her, and how by using it, she can either hurt God by swallowing it, or receive the pain of birthing God by not doing so. Also interesting how you got the shotgun in a wrapped up birthday present on the subway. Not really an interpretation for that, I just thought it was interesting. Regardless, we're pretty much done with the hospital. All you need to do now is grab some blood from this random hanging body and use it on a ritual so you can open up a nearby path beneath you that takes you to some strange sewage system where you'll meet Leonard Wolf. Leonard's appearance is very fish-like in nature, with gills on his back and wrinkled skin. His large swollen arms also correlate with how he would beat Claudia, which makes a lot of sense given his impulsively violent nature. Those gills I referenced also look like whip marks from a religious practice. Basically, he ended up using you in the same way Vincent was. He still believes in everything Claudia does, but doesn't agree with her methods of going about it. He was also severely abusive towards her, which might have contributed greatly to her personality. Anyway, upon finding out that you aren't interested in birthing God, he jumps down and prepares to kill you. This boss fight might actually be the most perplexing one yet, especially considering how badass they've been up until now. There's actually not much to this boss mechanically at all. He swims around, never specifically towards you, might I add, and sometimes pops up above the water where he's made vulnerable. If you get too close during this phase, then he'll attack you, but I pretty much cleared this fight with only gunshots. Everything about it is so grimy and nauseating, from the muddy waters and rusted walls to the rhythmic ringing gliding over the hellish drums and spine-chilling synths, but the aesthetic is much more creepy than the actual boss. He's not really that hard to kill, because he isn't really that threatening, and spends more time in the fight swimming around than actually attacking, which is kind of underwhelming. We're given a small cutscene in which Claudia and Vincent argue about the concept of God, which sheds a little bit of light on their philosophies, as well as a more direct reference to Claudia's abuse. It sheds some light on her black and white thinking, believing that with God, nobody will have to suffer in the way that she did, but Vincent does not think God has her best interests in mind. She wants to change the world to compensate for her own unhappiness, while Vincent wants to carve his own path and can't do so in the world she intends to create. Once you return to this apartment, you run into him and he lies to you about the previous conversation, saying that nobody else was here except him and Douglas, and it could not be more obvious that despite being your ally, Vincent is about as untrustworthy as they come. He's extremely sneaky and manipulative towards Heather, and it's clear he only needs her trust because he intends to gain something from her. Well, we're finally here. We're caught back up to the nightmare at the start of the game, and it is mostly the exact same, save for a few small changes that aren't particularly significant. So considering I already touched on this part, there's really no reason for me to go back over it. Like, one of the changes is that you get a roller coaster key to unlock the control panel where you can turn the roller coaster off, but even after doing so, it'll still turn back on, leaving Heather with no choice but to jump. We also get the conversation between Claudia and Douglas, which is really only here to put Douglas' character development on display. Despite being the closest thing to a true ally in this game, Douglas is a very troubled character, and his actions often border on morally gray. He even tells Claudia that her vision of peace seems boring, and considering he used to be on the Force, this aspect of his personality makes sense. He might thrive, in a way, on the conflict of humanity, and without it feels purposeless. On top of that, he's a man carrying the weight of his sins everywhere he goes, and probably knows that there is no place for a person like him in this heavenly utopia that Claudia intends to create. In any case, Heather wakes up and goes into a haunted mansion, and I love this fucking part so much because everything about it is shining with unique personality. First and foremost, it's easily the most out-of-place segment of the entire fucking game, kind of feeling more like a lengthy tribute to the elevator section in Silent Hill 2 with the trivia game. Like, it's incredibly cartoony and ridiculous, but there are a bunch of small details that I genuinely appreciate, like the story about a family that got killed, only for them to say that it's actually just a guy who hung himself or something, and Heather seems genuinely invested, which I think shows that part of her is still a child, and she even questions herself for being invested in what is obviously just a silly made-up story for the sake of a cheap scare in a haunted mansion. The next room has a jump scare that again is just super cheap. There's some guy sitting in a nearby chair, and a body falls down from the ceiling with a schlocky scream sound effect while the narrator goes on and on about who these people are. But what you'll come to notice about this mansion is how the fake and disingenuous scares that you'd find in any haunted mansion slowly become more genuine and menacing, and it starts to become much less cute when you realize he's actually talking directly to you.
I'm so sorry. This place is just falling apart. The mechanism is broken, you see. It wasn't supposed to stop there, I assure you.
Which fits the entire message of this game, the death of Heather's innocence. Childish, playful things that are corrupted with horrifying imagery. But it also contributes to the theme of stalkers as well, given you try to leave only to end up being chased down by a glowing light that instantly kills the player. You aren't allowed to leave, trapped and forced to run for your life just for partaking in the game. This is genuinely fucking brutal as hell, especially on hard mode because of the awkward camera angles. It's also like twice as long as the Pyramid Head chase scene, but with much less leniency than that one. I died to this fucking thing like 10 times before I finally got it, and I was pulling my fucking hair out. The amusement park is probably the easiest area in the game. The closest thing to a puzzle you get is a section where you're meant to bust open a gate by hooking it up to a ride with a chain and turning the ride on. Upon doing so, you'll run right into Douglas in what is one of my personal favorite cutscenes in the entire game. It's a vulnerable moment as he is severely injured and resting, while Heather shows great concern for him. She acknowledges that her freakout from earlier was unfair and that it really isn't his fault her father is dead, but what brings these two characters together is their mutual understanding of loss. He tells her about how much she reminds him of his son, who had died in a bank robbery. It should also be noted that he stated earlier in the game that he has killed people before, which I'm only taking note of because it seems plausible that he might have accidentally taken his own son's life, thus incentivizing him to leave the force and become a detective. Although that's not really confirmed, it's just my own headcanon. But with that being said, this moment is genuinely great because these two characters have both lost people that are important to them. However, we're still reminded that Douglas is not perfect, as he momentarily considers killing Heather in order to put an end to all this hell, but he doesn't end up pulling the trigger. He can't bring himself to, because he isn't the killer he believes himself to be. Anyway, upon moving on, you can progress forward with a straightforward fairy tale puzzle. Also, this is the coolest fucking dragon I've ever seen in my life. In any case, it's time to progress onward to the carousel ride. I think the same one where you fought Sybil Bennett, and apparently canonically killed her, even though I always choose to save her in the end, but I guess the real-life world of Silent Hill doesn't think that's a good idea, even though that particular scene unlocks a cutscene where Harry tells her the truth. Kind of disappointing, but I get it. Anyway, this entire boss fight right here is just brimming with atmosphere. The ride starts by itself, and you're urged to kill every single horse one by one. They look alive, moving ever so slightly and groaning when the player kills them. They even bleed upon impact, and it's genuinely unsettling. But after you kill every single one, the ride isn't over yet. If you remember that mirror used as a way of taunting Heather, this boss fight ends up being you versus the creepy reflection you saw. I love the way the horses are all shrouded in that sticky red substance, and the weird religious chanting as she appears, as well as the unsettling scream when you attack her. That being said, I've got a few bones to pick with this particular boss. I think for starters, it's a little bit too repetitive. Like, it goes on and on and on. You don't just kill her one time, you need to kill her multiple times, and each phase she has a different weapon. The janky camera and the nauseating controls feel eerie and challenging at first, but it got really old really fast. That being said, I do appreciate the psychological and existential aspect of it. The thought of having to kill yourself over and over again seems terrifying, and it's probably on some level how Heather has felt through this entire experience. Which takes me to the last and final area of the entire game, the chapel, which is actually pretty damn good. You're given a cutscene where you meet Claudia one last time and attempt to convince her to call off this whole charade, but she still remains stubbornly insistent on her beliefs. No matter what horrible things she has to do, or what rationalization you give her, she genuinely believes that all of this will be worth it in the end. There is a confession booth nearby where a crying woman confesses to revenge after killing someone. The guilt and emotions pour out through her tears, and the desperation in her voice is meek and fragile. This particular scene plays a huge role in dictating how the game ends, which I'll touch on later, but for now you're simply given the choice to forgive her. It isn't quite known who this woman is, but some theorize it's Dahlia, though I'm not really sure if I agree. I think this random, mysterious woman is meant to correlate with Heather and her quest of revenge, but also with Claudia and her delusional belief that her actions are just and righteous. In any case, the chapel is probably the most confusing area in the game, which is fitting because it's meant to correlate with nowhere from the first game. The ambience is just as rigid as it's always been, with bloody footsteps walking into a painting and the sound of a crying little girl. There's even a room where a monster behind a nearby wall moves back and forth, but can't seem to get to you, adding to the feeling that you're always being watched no matter where you go. Most of the rooms seem to bombard you with enemies, with insane cancers blocking off narrow hallways, and there's even a few more scrapers, similar to the missionary that you fought. You know, the one that killed your dad? Yeah, they're very fucking strong and do a shit ton of damage, plus they're extremely fast and usually hang out around areas where the player is at risk for falling to their death or in narrow corridors. In fact, I'm noticing that much of this area is the complete opposite of the mall at the start of the game. Now that you've made it this far into Silent Hill, everything is extremely cramped and tightly knit, making it hard to get around and almost smothering the player. Anyway, upon making it to the library, you're given one last confrontation with Vincent, who continues to try and convince you he's trustworthy and totally on your side, but even while doing so, he mocks you and psychologically manipulates and gaslights you by suggesting that all the monsters you killed were human.
You feel excited when you step on them and snuff out their lives.
Are you talking about the monsters?
Monsters? They look like monsters to you?
Oh no.
Don't worry. It's just a joke.
I fucking love this goddamn line because it made me audibly gasp. It actually makes you seriously question if you've been doing the right thing this whole time, or if maybe they weren't monsters after all. Of course, I don't believe him, and I think he's genuinely just making this up to fuck with you, but it is a very good cutscene regardless. It even kind of feels like he's talking to the player as well, acknowledging that this is a video game, and that there is some catharsis to simulated violence, perhaps even questioning the moral implication of that. The atmosphere here might be my personal favorite. There's so many details I can take note of, like how there's a hole in the wall peeking outside the chapel, but all you see is a black nothingness, really displaying this place as the point of no return. Everything is so rusted and worn down, and many rooms are overrun with corpses and blood. Sometimes textures on the walls even move. Also, it keeps up that tradition of new enemies spawning once the player enters a certain room in order to catch you off guard. As you get closer to the end of the dungeon, rooms that were previously normal begin to get overrun with blood, and it becomes impossible to even see anything, shrouding you in complete chaos. There are several enemies that you've already encountered before, but for some reason now they're all on fucking steroids and take even more hits and do even more damage, which is insane when you keep in mind that they're already extremely beefy as hell. Anyway, the goal here is pretty straightforward. You explore through this place as Heather creates a map in correspondence with wherever you go. You have to collect some tarot cards, which is almost beat for beat exactly what you had to do in the first game. Then you have to go back to the bedroom that Alessa slept in when she was a little girl and use them on this door. Consulting a nearby poem tells you what goes where. In easy mode, you just figure it out through a really cute and childish drawing. Normal has you interpret a strange poem, painting this detailed picture that the player translates into a simplistic format. It's just like every other Silent Hill puzzle up until this point, but on hard mode you have to basically decode a series of letters with Roman numerals on each card that are very small and subtle, and you're not really given much of a hint. But even so, it's the easiest fucking puzzle on hard mode. However, I think it's still really fun to figure out without a guide, even if the normal version is my preferred one. Now we finally made it. We have arrived at our destination, where Claudia and Vincent seem to be having a final confrontation. Vincent tries to basically do the same thing that happened 17 years ago by using the Seal of Metatron. Claudia stabs him, and then reveals that it doesn't even fucking work, meaning this jackass died for nothing, which is honestly hilarious. This part's really fucking weird though, because after this cutscene you're given free reign to do whatever. You can shoot Claudia, but that leads to a game over, and so this part is very confusing and leaves the player no clues on what to do next. As it turns out, you're supposed to eat this thing your dad gave you that's just been sort of sitting in your inventory. It's a bit of an ass pull and a little trial and error, but considering how few moments there actually are like this, I guess it's fine. Anyway, Heather pukes up the baby, and then Claudia desperately takes it into herself so she can birth God, only to create a hole in the ground that looks a little bit like a vagina for a very obvious reason. But upon jumping down, you finally get to kill this obnoxious bitch and fight the final boss of the game. Simply called the God, this terrifying beast is a skeletal monster with the face of Alessa. Considering she was born from hatred, this could be a way of saying that the actions of the Order ate Alessa alive until there was nothing left but bone. She has the ability of fire, which is straightforwardly a reference to the flame that consumed her time and time again. God is also fought deep underground, which could be symbolic that God, or at least the Order's God, is linked closer to mankind, hell, or earth than someplace celestial such as the sky, heaven, or cosmos. Heather's fight with this monster could also be seen as a way of her overcoming Alessa's abusive past, as well as the influence of the Order. However, it's hard to interpret this monster very much given how difficult it is to tell what parts of this monster are just Silent Hill, and what parts are actually the world of the Order and Claudia's wish. The thing is that the vision of God the Order had in their paintings doesn't look like this at all, which is actually very fitting. Rather than being divine or serene, she's extremely diabolical and threatening. There is so much more I could go into regarding the symbolism here, like the veil placed over her face to correlate with death in juxtaposition to birth, or the tarot card that she gets compared to in one of the books being a subtle reference to a god of hatred, emphasizing further the idea that a god born of hatred is no god at all. But to be honest, I'm tired. This video is taking forever, and you already get the fucking point. So all that's really left to talk about is the actual boss fight itself, which is pretty damn cool. Basically, the player is left with only the ammo and resources they've conserved up until this point. If you're too close, she'll smack you with her hand, and much unlike every other opponent in this game, it is nearly impossible to block, because she is extremely fast. But if the player falls back and uses far-range attacks, then she shoots fire at you that gets progressively more intense the closer you get to killing her. The organ music adds to this crazy-ass fight, and in hard mode she has a fuck ton of health. I couldn't even kill her. I just kept fighting her for like 45 minutes straight, and I ended up dying and just completely gave up. This boss is honestly part of why the game is intentionally designed to keep the player from wasting all their ammo, because close range on this woman is actually a hell of a lot harder to pull off than far range. In any case, upon finally killing her, Heather breaks down in tears at the realization that now she's gotten her revenge, but her dad is still gone. All that is left is pain and anguish. Killing God didn't bring him back. Now, there are a few endings in this game that I want to briefly talk about. The first is the normal ending, in which Heather comes back to Douglas and jokes with him a little bit. It's cute, but also kind of sad, because it shows that despite her pain and anguish, Heather has realized that life will inherently be painful, and uses humor as a coping mechanism. She might have lost her dad, but she's alive, and all that's left to do now is pick up the broken pieces and keep moving. This one is my personal favorite, especially since she decides she wants to be called Cheryl, the name her father gave her. But once again, as is typical of the Silent Hill games, this is not the only ending. You have the one where Heather chooses to actually go through with killing Douglas as a means of revenge, an ending that doesn't really make all that much sense to me and feels like a complete 180, but it is called the possessed ending, and this might be the actions of Alessa herself. Who knows, really? It doesn't make much sense to me, which is why I'm glad it's an ending you can only really get upon replay. Though it isn't completely out of character, since it's unlocked by both taking too much damage and by killing too many enemies, as well as playing God and forgiving that woman in the booth, all of which feels like an acknowledgement of the ludonarrative dissonance in Heather's character, and might also be further reflective of what Vincent said regarding the monsters. So I don't know. Also, the UFO ending is a bit strange compared to the other two. I think it's much more cute. On replay, you can be a magical girl and get this sexy beam move, where you instantly kill enemies with your sexy beam and kill everything before you even get back to your house. And upon doing so, you come home to see that your father is alive and well, and an alien and James? What, James?
James, honey.
Yeah, I'm so happy this exists, because everything about it is insanely just ridiculous in every conceivable way. And I think the developer's sense of personality really shines through. I just love that these terrifying and tragic atmospheric horror games still go out of their way to include humor in the New Game Plus. It's absolutely fantastic, and that pretty much covers all bases as far as this game is concerned, so I think it's high time we wrap up this behemoth of a video. While the first Silent Hill is insanely well crafted and revolutionary for spinning PS1 horror games into something very unique, expanding the Resident Evil formula in a very thought-provoking way, and Silent Hill 2 decided to change it into a more uniquely melancholic game that showed horror wasn't just about fear, but could also write a genuinely tragic and heartfelt story without ever needing to put in much dialogue. They are both fantastic fucking games, and deserve every bit of love and adoration that they get, but Silent Hill 3 is the most terrifying fucking thing I have ever played. Being a man, obviously, I do not fully internalize or understand what it's like to be a woman, but just about every woman I've ever been friends with, or had any sort of connection with at all, can share some pretty disturbing stories about men that they've met. Plus, I have had to deal with stalkers in the past, albeit not very many. So having to imagine dealing with that as an everyday occurrence rather than the exception is a genuinely scary thought, and my heart does go out to any women that might be watching this and have had to deal with or might still continue to deal with being objectified and harassed. Silent Hill 3's monsters have the scariest fucking design in the entire series. The first was creepy at times, feeling very unwelcoming and unsettling, but for the most part it was pretty simple. The second focused more on a melancholic atmosphere that was otherwise ruined by the hard mode. It's a much more simple game in its own right, and I'm fine with that because the aesthetic is so unique, and Silent Hill 3's hard mode does not disappoint me in that regard, as the monsters are genuinely horrifying in this fucking game. Like, the only monster in 2 that feels even remotely close to what is present all over this title is the abstract daddy thing, and it is the only monster in Silent Hill 2 that actually makes me fucking piss myself. The rest I just find fascinating and interesting, and maybe I'll get a little bit anxious from them being so close to me, but otherwise I'm just not that scared of them. I know some people may not, like that take, or might feel like I'm invalidating Silent Hill 2, but that's actually not what I'm trying to do at all. I appreciate the tragic aspects of that game a hell of a lot more, because the entire experience feels a lot more intimate, and all those monsters are all still creepy, just in a completely different way than in this game, where it feels like the game itself wants to physically grow arms and legs, grab the nearest shiv, and stab you to death. Because even when you're not dealing with enemies, the environment itself still tries to kill you whenever it can, just for the fuck of it. Because why not? Might as well, right? Which is another thing about this particular title that I don't think people understand. I've seen so many people online complain about how it's just a sequel to the first game, and that it's lacking originality or depth of the second. It might be much easier to follow than those games, but it's still just as ripe with symbolism and metaphors as them, and I think in some ways, I can see that a sequel to the first game was kind of necessary, given that one literally made no fucking sense at all, and most of my theories were derived from this one anyway. Sure, Silent Hill 3 isn't a sad game. There are sad moments in it that are meaningful, but it never makes me cry in the way that the last one did. However, it is genuinely horrifying, and it's even more horrifying than the first game. I honestly don't understand how anybody could feel otherwise. The atmosphere is still definitely present, just a hell of a lot more tense and anxiety-inducing in order to fit the tone of the first game. It doesn't match the uncanny valley of a somber and terrifying yet comforting game like the previous one, and I honestly don't want it to be. It's still just as atmospheric and creative. Plus, the claims that this game is also too focused on combat is a bit of a ridiculous take, considering it's just as stiff and difficult to navigate as the last two games as well. The intention has always been survival horror from the get-go. The weapons might be a little bit more absurd, but considering you get the Pyramid Head sword in the last game, I'm really not sure what people expected. Though the most ridiculous take I've seen thrown around is that the symbolism and overall story are unrelated, and that is just not true. This symbolism might carry much of the depth of this game, but that as well is in similar fashion to how the last two games are framed. The religious cult and their fixation on forcing you to birth God is meant to correlate with the themes of misogyny, pregnancy, and Heather's fear of motherhood. It isn't just a part-time story about Heather's puberty and anxieties, and a full-time story about the cult. All that reads as some people not caring about the cult and failing to pick up on how that correlates to Heather's inner demons, but considering she's a reincarnation of Alessa, the cult is completely necessary for the sake of her story. Plus, the few parallels between this game and the original is to emphasize an added theme of how history repeats itself time and time again as we take after our parents. This game basically duped you into thinking it's a lot simpler than it actually is, because all the extra details are hiding in plain sight, while the external story serves the purpose of elaborating further on the way Silent Hill works. Even when I know I'm not at threat, there is never a single moment in this entire game where I feel safe, which is part of what makes things so difficult for me when picking my favorite, or even being forced to compare this to Silent Hill 2. Because that game deserves every bit of praise that it gets, and I wish more horror games took a page out of its book. It's hard to find something with that level of melancholic atmosphere, but part of the charm of these games is how each entry is different, and in my opinion, Silent Hill 3 feels like the peak of what horror can achieve. This game is brimming with creativity in every orifice, and I've never seen any game achieve fear in the way this title has. And for that, it is an absolute masterwork that I could not recommend more. I consider this game equal in quality to Silent Hill 2, but I think it deserves to be held in the same regard as that game, and I will stand by that take for as long as I live, because this game is fucking perfect, and I would not change anything about it.